This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. My very special guest today is Debbie Phillips, formerly, until quite recently actually, our state representative in the Ohio legislature, and now working with Rural Action.
Thank you so much for inviting me onto the show with you, Lois.
Right. Well, we talked some years ago. I believe it was when you were in the legislature, actually, because you were on for 8 years.
Correct.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and I couldn't remember exactly when I was on the show previously,
yes.
but I think it was early on
Yes.
in my service in the House.
Right, yes. Well, a lot of water under the bridge since then, I guess.
Yeah.
But I'm wearing my Ohio t-shirt. Actually, this is a bicentennial t-shirt, so it comes from 2003, which was the bicentennial of Ohio. And actually, the day that's a state day is coming up very soon. I believe it's March 1st, and we're talking in late February now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So do you remember any special things that were done to celebrate something like an anniversary like that?
Oh, the bicentennial? The state had a huge bicentennial commission, and I think one of the projects that has been one that's had some lasting impact in some of our communities was the barns. The painting of one barn in each county with the bicentennial logo.
Oh, right.
So those are still out there, and there are people who like to drive around and look at the different barns. And a lot of different counties in the state had their own celebrations for Ohio's bicentennial.
Yes, not to mention their own county celebration. I remember actually a very nice picture was taken of my husband and me. It must have been 1997 somehow. I don't know, but that I guess was the city of Athens itself was dated from that far back. And of course at the time we were part of Washington County or whatever. Washington County kept getting smaller and smaller as other counties spread out, you know, from it. But yeah, it's nice to have special event days like that. What would you say is the thing that you remember best, most happily perhaps, from your service in the legislature?
Wow, that is a great question. I think the thing that has been the most gratifying about that service really has been the work with individual constituents who had some issue dealing with state government and being able to help people figure out who to talk to and which doors needed open to solve a problem. There just were times that we were able to help people connect with the right person and get an answer for something that had been dragging on for a long time. So it's not the kind of thing you read about in a civics textbook about the legislative branch, but people would call about a whole variety of different issues. One example was an individual called us at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and she was an older individual who lived in one of the neighboring counties in the district, and she was out of propane. And this was a February going into a weekend when the forecast was for single-digit temperatures.
Oh, wow.
And it was really, we were able to call the county JFS director and the local ministerial association, and people were able to go to her house and make sure she had space heaters and neighbors to check on her through the weekend. And then the ministerial association helped untangle the problem she'd been having with her bill. There were some errors and it was confusing. So even though it wasn't exactly a state government issue, knowing that we were able to help somebody find the right person to solve a problem was really rewarding. And I love the policy work also, but I think that can take so long And change can be so incremental that the personally rewarding part was being able to like solve a problem and help somebody's day go better. So it's the whole range of activities.
Right. Well, unfortunately, it reminds me of having read, I think, the New York Times yesterday, which was full of articles about problems that some of the senators and congressmen have been having with town meetings back home in the district, where there were really packed with angry people who wanted to complain about. In each case, I guess these were all Republican, actually all Republican representatives or senators who were having difficulties because our new president, you know, is a Republican, and there have been a number of problems already that people have felt.
Well, I think that people are frustrated with some of the things that have been happening, and it's important for legislators to be talking with their constituents.
Yes.
During the time that I served in the House, I regularly held roundtable discussions in each of the counties in my district.
Oh yes, I remember
and
visiting one or two of those.
Yeah,
yes.
And we would usually go around and make sure everybody had an opportunity to say what the things are they hoped we would talk about, because some people were interested in the same topic, and then I was able to spend more time addressing that issue. And sometimes people came with a very specific thing that they needed help dealing with, you know, the Department of Insurance or something like that, and we would talk after the meeting about those one-on-one kind of issues.
Right.
But I think having those regular opportunities for people to talk with legislators helps, so you don't have so much pent-up frustration that, you know, people who feel like there's nobody listening.
Right.
But I think that, you know, some of the issues on the national level are so far-reaching and affect so many people. Like the proposals that are being floated about possible changes to the Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
Clearly there were problems that needed to be fixed there, and there were people for whom it wasn't working. But there are a lot more people who have insurance now.
Yes.
Kids are able to stay on their parents' insurance. Insurance companies can't top you out. They used to, if you paid, you know, you could pay your premiums and have a policy, but if you had some horrible thing happened and your bills got to be astronomical, there would be a point where you would hit a lifetime limit, and they'd say, we're not paying for anything else, right? And so that's something that they can't do anymore, that has helped some people stay alive and keep getting the care that they need.
Yes.
So, you know, I think when something that affects that many people on such a personal level is up for discussion and possible changes or elimination, the people are going to have strong feelings about it.
Yes,
that's legitimate. Yeah, yeah. And
well,
so I hope legislators will listen to their constituents, because there are times that the parties do try to, you know, line their people up and get everybody to vote a certain way, and that's not the way it's supposed to work. You know, we're supposed to represent the people in our districts, right? The folks who voted for people or not, but the people who live in the district. And different parts of the country are different and have different interests.
Yes.
And, you know, legislators shouldn't always just go along with the party line.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it is interesting because a number of these, again, on the national level, have just seen what's happened to some of their colleagues and said, no, I'm not going to have any round table or town hall meeting or whatever, because they've seen that there's been a lot of this pent-up frustration and anger coming out.
I did see some reports of citizens holding their own town hall meeting and inviting their members of Congress if there wasn't one scheduled. And that's, you know, it's I think it's good for legislators to stay in touch with the people they represent. So
Yes.
I hope that they will find ways to do that where there can be a real dialogue. It can be really hard if people are at a, like a public forum and they just want to spout off about stuff. It can be really hard to have a productive discussion
Yes.
in that kind of environment.
Right.
But it is important to listen.
Yes. Well, and last week I went to a Democratic meeting here in Athens that was held to sort of look back at the election and what did we learn, so on. And it's interesting because, of course, the Democrats are so, at least because of the city of Athens, was one of the blue areas of the state. You look at the election map from last fall, and there are a few blue spots around, the big cities, of course, but other than the big cities, the rural areas are not very well represented at all by the Democrats.
That's true.
And but there were a lot of suggestions that came out of that meeting about, out-of-date phone lists and people trying to make calls and just getting no answer, or that the phone had been disconnected, or plus which now we have such a problem with, they've depended on phone contacts for a long time, but now so many people have cell phones and there's no kind of a directory for cell phones. So you really can't reach a lot of people by phone anymore.
Yeah, when I ran for office, I generally did a lot of door-to-door canvassing, and I really enjoyed that process of just getting out into different communities and being able to talk with people for a few minutes on their doorstep. There are a lot of folks who are really busy and resent the intrusion of a phone call, but a face-to-face conversation has a different feel to it. And even in the middle of everybody's busyness and getting dinner together and taking care of kids and all that, I found a lot of people willing to take a few minutes to tell me the things that they were concerned about and what they really thought I should be working on as their state rep. And I think that door-to-door and talking to people directly it's a great way to get out there and campaign for anybody, whether you're running for a local office or something larger. So
must be rather hard though for a congressional candidate.
Those are big districts.
500,000 people or whatever in a district.
Right. I did just a state house campaign might be the largest territory where you could really get out there and knock on enough doors yourself as an individual. This district is about 3.5 counties. And some places are not walkable, right? I mean, it's a very hilly and rural area, so I would do as much as I could in the towns and then make phone calls to places that it just wouldn't be efficient to try to get out and do door to door. So that can. The other thing that I would do for that is I had some listening tours. So I would go to some of the small towns and use a library or a volunteer fire department or some other building that had a meeting room and do. I think sometimes I sent postcards out, and sometimes I used a robocall system, and I hate robocalls that are trying to tell people how to vote, but I would use it just to invite people to come to a thing and say, look, I'm going to be in your town for a couple hours. I'll bring cider and cookies, and I hope I'll get a chance to hear from you about what your concerns are. So at least in the places where it's hard to get out door to door and talk to a lot of folks, people would know they had the opportunity to come and talk with me directly. And some of those, maybe just 4 or 5 people showed up, and I think one of them we had like 60 people. So it really varied wildly based on what the local issues were, whether there was something going on that people felt a burning need to talk to their state rep about.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I know that well, I guess it was not just last year, but perhaps the year before. I'm not sure. You can correct me on this. Tell me what it is. But I thought it was very interesting that the legislature decided to set things up so that I guess it's after the next census, they would make a real effort not to gerrymander.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the congressional districts
Not the
process
congressional, right.
was not included. So this
Right.
is just the reapportionment of for the state, House, and Senate
Yes.
districts. And that process happens at the same time as congressional redistricting. So after the census, people move, and we have this value in our democratic system of one person, one vote, that our votes should have roughly equal weight. And so because people move around, the districts change. So that's the rationale for redoing the districts.
Yes.
When we went through it last time, for a state house district, if you take the whole population of the state and divide it, there should be about 116,000 people in a district.
Oh, really?
And before the districts were redrawn, my district had about 123,000 people in it. So that means that people here had a slightly weaker voice in state government than people in a neighboring district that had fewer people, right? So that's the theory behind why we have this
Right.
process to redo the districts, to keep our votes of equal weight and keep representation equal at the state house.
I can remember, pardon me for interrupting, but in the 1960s, which is now 50 plus years ago, they had not redistricted. I think it was someplace in Tennessee. They had not redistricted since 1910 or whatever. They just, hey, we're glad with what we've got. And rural areas were vastly overrepresented in a way, so that it finally got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, you can't keep doing this sort of thing.
It's just not fair.
It's not fair. And since then, there's supposedly at least a real effort to make people's votes not so different.
Right. And so we had, even before the ballot issue, our state constitution laid out the process to create districts that would be fairly equitable. And they were supposed to keep communities whole where that's possible. So if you can keep a county whole, it's supposed to be all together in one district. And that we have a few single county districts, like Columbiana County has about the right population to be in one house. So there were a few like that. And then cities and townships, if you could keep them whole, you're supposed to. They have to have roughly equal population. They should, if possible, be similar to the district lines that existed before, so it doesn't get completely rejiggered, right? So there was a list of criteria in the Constitution. When the maps were done last time around, the House Democrats sued because we looked at the maps, and there were several hundred splits where counties, townships, and cities were split into different districts. And you can't hold every community whole, right?
Yes.
Franklin County has so many people in it, it's going to be chopped up in a bunch of different house districts.
Yes.
Because it just, it has to be. But we were able to draw a map. I think we did 2 different versions of the map that had fewer than 100 splits, as opposed to the several hundred that are in the current map. And so we took it to the state Supreme Court and challenged these maps. And it was a 4-3 decision. So even with our Ohio Supreme Court having 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat, we still had 3 of the justices that voted with us. And the argument in the court, I went and listened to the oral arguments, and the argument was about punctuation.
Really?
The argument was, is the list in the Constitution a rank-ordered list that you have to do this thing first and then this thing, or do you get to choose among the different things?
Oh,
So
as to which is most.
the majority
Yeah.
who made the map said, well, we decided to keep the districts more like what they used to be. We picked that criteria as more important, right? That criterion. So that was literally what it came down to in the court decision, was punctuation. This is why people always say the details matter in legislation. When it winds up in court, the argument can be about something tiny. So the issue that was on the ballot makes it very clear, and it has a rank-ordered list that the districts have to keep existing jurisdictions whole where they can. You have to be able to draw a single line that doesn't cross itself around the district, and it has to all be contiguous. There is a little piece of a township that's part of my district that doesn't touch the rest of the district. So, you know, the map making got pretty crazy and creative to generate a particular political outcome.
Right.
You know, and that's why it's called gerrymandering, right? They come up with these crazy, crazy districts.
There was a fellow called Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, and gee, that was like about 1815 or something like that. It was a long time ago, but
didn't they make a salamander-shaped district?
Yes, a salamander-shaped district. And so they called it a gerrymander,
right?
After the fellow who was apparently most liable for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the bit about punctuation, I have a friend you probably know, Drew Everts. She has a lot of grandchildren, and one of the grandchildren gave her a button which emphasizes punctuation, and since she is an English professor who specialized in things like punctuation.
I think Jim had her as a professor when he was a student.
Probably so, yeah. She was always really tough on that, really tough. But anyway, this button it makes a difference. It says, "Let's eat, Grandma." Okay, if you put in a comma after "let's eat," it's pretty good. But if you leave out the comma, it sounds like cannibalism.
Yeah. So it makes a difference. So this, the new plan, I have hope that it will lead to a process that is a little bit less partisan. If you followed the process last time, the committee that worked on drawing the maps rented a hotel room in downtown Columbus to have the meetings, and they set it up as an office. They took the hotel furniture out, they set it up as an office because it was close to the State House offices, and they referred to it in emails back and forth, which became public. They referred to it as the bunker. The meetings they had in the bunker, and they invited some business owners and donors to come in and weigh in on how they wanted certain districts to look, and it was not what your high school civics textbook would have you believe is the way we should do this. It was very political, and I think that people want to choose their representatives rather than having representatives choose their voters.
Yes.
And this should, I think it'll be better next time around.
Yeah. Right. Well, it is a continuing problem, because I can remember when the Democrats were in control in Ohio, they didn't want to be too fair. They were doing plenty of gerrymandering themselves. And it's always a tendency, you know.
I also learned by living through that process, being in the House while we went through reapportionment, I learned a really interesting thing. So under the Voting Rights Act, if you can create a majority-minority district to increase representation by African American legislators, you have to do that. And there's a built-in tension because of the way populations are spread around, right? Just demographically where people live, there's a built-in tension between creating majority minority or at least minority influenced districts and creating more competitive districts, right? Just because of the way people tend to vote and where people tend to live.
Right.
So there were some tensions within the Democratic caucus with the Black caucus going through this process. Because if you try to make more districts that are kind of a level playing field politically, it might water down the African American vote in some districts. And those were some very frank and very painful conversations among friends during that process. There probably are some wounds that haven't healed from that last time around.
Probably not. Well, but the congressional districts, hey, those are really, I think we felt that more in this area than practically anywhere else in the state, because it wound up as being a sort of a thing that went from the outskirts of Cincinnati to the east, and then turned around and went back west on the next level up.
Right.
And in fact, it was so out of line, kind of.
Well, and the 6th congressional district reaches about from Portsmouth to Youngstown, right? I mean, along the river and along Skinny River District. So that's I think it's difficult for anybody to fairly represent a community when they're so strung out and they're such different types of communities. I think it's got to be hard for a member of Congress to think about what's going to be good for, Meigs County and what's going to be good for Youngstown. Those might not be the same thing.
Right.
Right. So I think it creates a real tough responsibility for that person.
Right. It does. Well, I know that there are certain issues that have always been of particular interest to you, I think, especially of education. And I recall, it's about 17 years ago now, when I was at Rural Action. I was helping out with Rural Action. They had a grant to work on education from a group in New England. And I did some of the preliminary things, about the education, since I had been on the school board here in Athens at one point, and including on the Tri-County Joint Vocational School Board, which is 3 counties, as it says, and so on. So I had done some of the preliminary contacts around, like in Meigs County and so forth. And then you came along and you took that over and you made that your really big issue, which was wonderful.
Yeah, that was a really great project. I got the wonderful opportunity to work with Marianne Flournoy in the beginning of that work. We, at that point, the state was, because of the school funding decision in Duralf v. State of Ohio, right, where they found the whole school funding system unconstitutional. One of the results of that litigation was the creation of the School Facilities Commission, and the state decided to put significant money into building new schools. There were many schools that were seriously in disrepair. There were lots of leaky roofs and mold problems and buildings that didn't have sufficient heat and air conditioning, and all kinds of challenges that districts were facing. And the state, prior to that, hadn't really spent very much money on the buildings themselves. So what Marianne and I did in that project was to really try to get communities involved in planning when their school district was going through the school facilities process. Because it was going to be this huge investment in facilities in rural areas, because the state set the program up to build the schools in the poorest school districts first. So a lot of our school districts were very, very early in the pipeline to get that state money for buildings. And we just wanted to make sure that with this big infusion of capital into our region, that people in the communities were part of that discussion and
Yes.
actually got what they wanted, instead of just having some cookie cutter thing. And it was really fun. We talked to a lot of superintendents and a lot of educators in the region about what they were looking for and what questions. We talked to the first people who'd been through the process, to say, what questions do you wish you had asked at the beginning? So then we could go to the districts that were coming up next to say, your peers suggest that you ask these questions. But it was really, really fun. And then an offshoot of that is a lot of community groups trying to figure out what to do with buildings that were no longer going to be used by the schools.
Right.
So there are certain groups that have kind of taken over, either are renting or have been given facilities that aren't being used by school districts, and they're being used as community centers and all kinds of different
like
functions.
Shade. I was thinking of Shade, where the former, they must have had a real building boom about 1925 to 35 or something like that, because take this building, for instance, which is now full of offices of all sorts.
The old school in Albany has a restaurant in it, and the village offices, I think.
Is that right?
Yeah. There are a bunch of them.
Yeah, and good, strong buildings, built of brick and so forth. In fact, you can pick it out in every small community, practically. You can see what was a former school, which may not be a school any longer. Like
and some
this
of them have portions that may not really be usable, but portions that are. And in some communities, the districts chose to go to one campus just because of busing issues and a lot of different reasons that districts would change their configuration or past consolidation. But there are a lot of groups that formed to use those buildings. We had some Rural Action Vistas who worked with some of those groups, and I believe the Federal Valley Resource Center out in Stewart is one that some Rural Action Vistas worked with folks to try to help them think through all the different issues. Like in these big old buildings, how are you going to pay to heat and cool it? Because they are
large.
Yeah, so that can be pricey.
Right.
So that work just got us more and more involved in the overall school funding issue, and we started working with a lot of teachers and students who wanted to be more involved in the debates about how the school funding system worked overall. So that was really fun.
Just in Athens County itself, there are something like 13 townships. And at one time, every township had a school. Well, that meant that there were some townships like Athens Township, which had really high, or York Township, where Nelsonville is, had really relatively high populations compared to some of the, and so you get the difference between, say, Federal Hocking, which is practically all of the eastern part of Athens County, but is such a rural area.
Yeah, and there are challenges. So one of the things that we've worked on when I was in the legislature in looking at the funding issue is transportation funding. So Federal Hocking District is so large, their bus fleet drives 3,000 miles a day. And so if you have to keep buses running and put fuel in them to drive 3,000 miles a day, that's a big chunk of your budget before you spend the first dollar on teachers or classroom materials or computers. So we really tried to look at some funding for purchasing buses and some supplemental funding for rural school districts, because that can chew up so much of your budget. So part of the inequity, is that different places in the state are different. A school district like Bexley, besides the fact that they've got a wealthier tax base and so they've got more local funding, it's also very small geographically. So the money that they bring in, they can spend a lot more of it in the classroom than they have to spend on buses compared to a district like Federal Hocking or Morgan Local.
Right.
That Morgan Local is pretty much county-wide. It's almost the whole county. So same thing, lots and lots of miles, lots of money spent on busing. And that's one of the things that, to me, is kind of low-hanging fruit for the legislature to address that would really help with equity for rural education.
You consider Trimble, for instance, Trimble Township. They have, the way things are set up, the local property tax depends on the valuation of the properties. And so 1 mil of property tax can be very, very low, as it is in Trimble Township. Something like 1 mil raises $20,000 or something like that.
I think it's more than that, but not a whole lot more.
Yeah, not a whole lot more. And Trimble Township is the, either the
Beechwood.
last or the next to last poorest district in the whole state.
Right, and a mill in Beechwood or some wealthy suburb somewhere
Right, will
raises
raise so
a lot
much
more money. Yeah.
More.
It was interesting. There were some suburban legislators during the peak of the school funding battle in the courts who had some town hall meetings, and they said those people who brought the lawsuit look at us like we're a bank they can come to pay for their kids' education because they don't want to pay for it themselves. That was the way they characterized our region with the lawsuit, that we were trying to make other people pay for our kids' education.
Yes.
But in reality, Trimble, at that time, Trimble had a school district income tax, and they had the highest tax effort of any school district in the state, which means the people who live there were paying the biggest percentage of their income for education.
Right.
So it's kind of like the widow's mite story in the Bible, right? I mean, it may not be a lot of money, but people are digging deeper than anywhere else to be able to provide for an education. So people do care.
Yes, and Trimble is famous for having very active group who are working to bring materials to the school.
The Trimble Textbook Foundation.
Yes.
Sam Jones is one of the leaders there from Sam's Gym. And I saw him a couple months ago in Crowers, and he gave me an update of how much they've done for that district, and it's really very cool.
Yes.
The way people have stepped up to make sure those kids have high quality educational opportunities too.
Right.
People care a lot. So, our state constitution is the place that that the education portion lives, right? So it was important enough to the people who founded the state of Ohio that they put in the Constitution that we should provide a system of public education that is available for all the kids. So it shouldn't matter where kids live. It shouldn't depend on their zip code if they're going to have a chance to take AP classes and have all those rich educational opportunities. That shouldn't depend on where a kid happens to be born.
Yes, and our Constitution actually dates back to 1851. It's only been amended many, many times since then. But the original Constitution was a little bit different, probably, no doubt, but
I've read
amazing.
I've read it because when there's like computers on the desk in the House and Senate, they aren't computers that connect to the whole internet. They just connect to the bills that are on the floor, the Ohio Revised Code, and the Constitution. And sometimes we have to sit there and wait for a long time for something to come back from the Senate, and people, socialize, and there are some times where we could be waiting for hours. And in one of those times, I just read the Ohio Constitution because it was there on the computer. And some of the amendments were things that were very specific, like the times that we have had a bonus to pay to veterans who served in particular conflicts. So that's something that was approved by the voters. It's a constitutional amendment, and that language is still there, even though it was only in effect for a certain period of time.
Yes.
So there are sections of the Constitution that are that were temporary law in a way, but they had to be in the Constitution. So it is. There have been a lot of amendments, and some of them are ongoing amendments, like the change in how the district lines are drawn, and some of them are things that are just to do a specific thing, and then the language just kind of lives there.
Yes.
So.
Well, it's good news to hear that you have right at your fingertips. People who are in the legislature have right at their fingertips all these resources that they can call up, especially when they're waiting around for some action to occur and still have to hang out and do something while you're waiting. That's pretty important.
Yeah. No, it's great. I can't even imagine, some bills. One of the first bills that I worked on was the name change bill to take the term mental retardation out of the Ohio Revised Code and change the department to the Department of Developmental Disabilities. This was something that local people came to me and to Jimmy Stewart, who was our senator at the time, and said, this is a term that has been used to call us names and hurt our feelings. And it was a group of self-advocates who said, we don't want this to be the name of the agency. So we worked on that bill to do a simple thing, right, to just change the name of an agency. And at that time, now everything's filed electronically, but at that time we had to file paper copies of bills. Do you have any idea how many pages it was to do that? There was lots of cross-referencing.
Oh, yeah. So
one copy of the bill was this much paper.
Wow.
It was, several reams of paper
Wow.
to file a copy of the bill. And so to think about the time when legislators did all of this stuff on paper and had to have paper copies of everything on their desk and mark changes up on, it's a process that kills a lot of trees.
Yes.
So switching over to electronic documents in state legislatures has been a really good thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
It's made the work a lot more efficient and saved some trees, I'm sure.
And you're the person who was there to witness.
Yeah, we use iPads in committee meetings now, so the testimony of people who come to speak to us has been loaded into the iPads, and we can click on it instead of having all that printed out. So the bill analysis, all the amendments, and the witness testimony, those documents are all loaded into iPads that are used in the committees now. So it's cool.
Well, it's cool. Of course, once in a while I think about, wouldn't it be awful if there was a tremendous crash of all this?
Yeah, yeah.
And it all disappeared.
Well, there have been times that they weren't working. There were network problems or something, and then the committee stands at ease for what they always say is 15 minutes more or less, which could be 2 hours, but whatever, however long it takes
more
for
less.
aides to go print things out and bring copies. So it's not, without its hitches, but
Right.
it does make things flow a little easier in general.
Well, the work that you did in education with Marianne Flournoy, let's see, what was her connection? She has a connection with other counties, I believe.
Well, Marianne, I think had a connection to the College of Education, and so she knew a lot of the school district administrators and a lot of educators, and so we worked together on the research portion of that school facilities work.
And then you set up a statewide organization concerned about education. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So people were really wanting to be more involved in the school funding issue, and it needed to be statewide. Rural Action works in about an 18-county area in southeastern Ohio and does a wide range of work that is kind of asset-based community development. So a whole lot of different things. The people who wanted to get more involved working on school funding, it felt like it needed to be very focused and it needed to be statewide. So we spun that out as a separate project and formed the Ohio Fair Schools campaign. And we had chapters in different regions of the state and local groups that kind of studied what was going on in their schools and would invite their legislators out to visit their schools and go in and testify on the budget when it would come through. So we worked with a lot of local groups. We also had a lot of fun working with teachers. We created some curriculum materials about how school funding works and property taxes and just all, how the formula worked and what has happened with lawsuits in other states around school funding. So there were some teachers who worked with their students to learn more about it, and then a lot of these kids talked to each other and created their own agenda of things that they wanted to talk to legislators about. And we, that collaboration was with rural and urban students meeting together. And some of those meetings of those students were just peak experiences for me, just getting to hear the discussion that they had. There was a moment where the students were in their teams with their school. We did a weekend-long retreat at a church camp, and they were writing down the things that were going on in their school and putting them up on the board on the wall and rearranging it to make a big web so they could see kind of how things were similar and different and what all the different issues were that they each had brought. And there was this moment when these kids from like East Cleveland and Van Wert and Meigs County and all over the state, all different kinds of communities, stepped back and they looked at the stuff they'd put up on the wall, and one of them said, I wish we had better things in common. They were dealing with leaky roofs and not enough textbooks, like a whole bunch of issues that it was astounding to them to see that even coming from very different communities, they had some of the same challenges and were able to figure out things they wanted to work on together. So I loved that work. It was really fun.
Yeah, and you did that for 5 or 6 years before you ran for the state legislature, I believe.
Yep. There were some moments that really crystallized things for me. We had a student who was 15 years old, and she testified in the House Finance Subcommittee that deals with school funding. And she talked about the cuts her school was making. They were losing all their teachers that taught elective classes, I think. They were just in significant financial difficulty. And the committee members, one in particular, asked her really aggressive questions. It was like a cross-examination in a courtroom or something. And this 15-year-old just, she did fine. She was up there just like, I'll have to look into that and get back to you. And a lot of times when kids testify in committee, the committee members are really nice to them. They're like, oh, you're going to be sitting in our seats one day. And, they really encourage these kids who have the guts to go and talk to legislators,
Yes.
And this girl, they just raked her over the coals. And during the break, several of adults who were in the room went and talked to committee members about the way they treated this girl who just was challenging them, right? And that was a moment for me of feeling like we needed new people there, that we needed, even if we don't agree, we have to be able to listen to the people who are affected by the decisions.
Yeah.
So there were moments like that where the more I was working on getting people involved in the process, the more I got drawn into it myself. And, yeah.
Well, what other, when you look back, what are some of the other policy things that you found of particular interest?
Well, one thing I'm really, really proud of is that we were able to get a provision in the budget that if kids are eligible for free lunch, so these are very low income students, schools can't charge them for their spelling workbook and like the things they need to be able to do their schoolwork. It's supposed to be a free, appropriate public education, right? But because of the financial challenges that districts have, they charge families for consumables a lot of times. So art supplies, math workbooks, spelling workbooks. You get a little letter at the beginning of the year to bring in your $18.65. Yeah. And I think most parents are fine with paying a little something for these things that their kids are going to use, but some people can't. So we got a provision in that if kids are eligible for free lunch, the district can't charge them for that stuff.
That's good.
That was something Jack Freck brought up,
Good.
brought to my
Right.
attention to work on.
He was always out there working jobs and family service, job and family services, I think is the correct way to say it,
Yep.
for so many years. And that meant that there was a lot of necessity in an area like ours, which has a lot of poverty. Yeah.
Yep. So that was really fun to work on. Working on energy efficiency and renewable energy policy was something that I really enjoyed. We had an alternative energy committee when the Democrats had the majority in the House, and we were able to tour some of the places that were doing really cool research around the state and see some of the manufacturing that's developing because of the surge in interest in renewable energy, and just a whole range of places. From, I got to visit the NASA Glenn Research Center, which is up in Cuyahoga County, and our own SunPower from here in Athens County is doing some work with them. I got to see where that experiment is running. I got to tour the facility that AEP has in Central Ohio, where they're doing research on energy efficiency and distributed generation and distributed storage. And so that was really, really neat work to be involved in. And glad that Governor Kasich was willing to exercise his veto and put our renewable portfolio standard back in place, because they did try to extend the freeze in
Right, that was a good move on his part.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up the question of budget, and of course you've also been talking about the costliness of things and the differences for the different local school districts, of which there are over 600 around the state. I believe we're in a budget year for the legislature, and you've been through that. You were through that at least 4 times, I think, probably. What do you have to say about the state budget?
My general sense of working on state budgets is that they make clear statements about priorities. And the details matter an awful lot. So you really have to be willing to dig in and look at the impact in local communities. I think that governors generally try to draft their budget in such a way that it's going to protect their pet projects and the things they're trying to do, and make it harder for the legislature to undo those things, because there's always this kind of whipsawing back and forth as it goes through the process, right? The governor introduces the budget, the House brings it forward, does a lot of work on it, and then it goes over to the Senate. So, and there are a lot of changes along the way. So when you look at the way the budget is when it's first introduced, it is nothing in there is set in stone, and people can engage in that process. I think that is a really, really important thing. We had, last time around, the governor's budget drove a lot more money to charter schools, and it would have cut most of the rural schools. A lot of the education groups worked together to make recommendations for changes, and the House did a lot of work on that. We really, Ryan Smith is the finance chairman. He's from Gallia County, so he understands the kind of school districts that we have, and the issues and challenges like the transportation challenge that we discussed.
Right.
So he really did dig in and work on that and make a lot of changes that helped. The Senate, unfortunately, didn't keep the work that the House had done. So it's just always a negotiation and a struggle back and forth. And the more people can like dig in their area where they have expertise and be in communication and monitor as it goes through, the better.
Yeah.
Because it can change a lot.
Right. Well, and now you're taking on new things, Debbie.
Yep.
We have just a couple minutes left. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days?
Sure. Well, I am the new development director for Rural Action, and I'm really excited about it. I love the work that Rural Action does. So I love the work that I have been doing and the privilege of representing people in the State House. But a lot of that work is really kind of head-to-head combat, and you know, work on something and then somebody else pulls it in a different direction. The thing that's exciting for me about working with Rural Action is having this sense that people are engaged in very positive work in the community and working together. And you know, so it's just a very different environment, and it's really just fun to work with such great people.
Right. And it's actually in a new place, isn't it? A new location. We used to be up in Trimble.
Yeah. We were in the old church there in Trimble on Walnut Street, and there still are some Rural Action offices there.
Yes.
I'm working out of the Cure Center for Rural Renewal, which is in the Plains. So it's up next to the Lindley Inn.
Yes.
And it's in a really interesting historic building. It's the old Johnson House, which was the family that owned some mines in the region. You know, the Eclipse Company town is kind of right below that. So it's just a neat place. Some of the programming is similar to what it was when I worked at Rural Action before. So the work on watershed restoration and cleaning up acid mine drainage and improving the streams in our area, that is ongoing. So that work is...
It'll never end, actually.
Well, and they're making great progress. It's really exciting. There are fish in those streams that, you know, hadn't been there in the lives, in the memory of people, you know, who've been alive for a long time. So there are changes happening out there on the ground. The environmental education work and the camps for kids and all of that is still happening. And there are some new things, like working on social enterprises, businesses that have a positive impact in the community, like the Chester Hill Produce Auction. And the Zero Waste program, Zero Waste Event Productions, where they're going and doing all that recycling and composting at festivals. And then an even newer effort is to work with some of the local communities on entrepreneurial communities, and really trying to engage folks in local communities on how they can work to rejuvenate the economy in their town.
Pretty important things.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's really fun to see what's going on there, and you know, and my job is going to be to help us broaden the base of support for that work. Right now, a huge challenge is that the National Service Program is one of the things that is being proposed to be eliminated in the federal budget. So Rural Action has a huge AmeriCorps and VISTA program. We have a lot of people who are doing their national service with Rural Action, and that helps us get out there and do all this great work. So we're going to be trying to find ways to support that and continue.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you, Debbie.
Thank you.
My guest today has been Debbie Phillips, former state representative, got term limited out after 8 years, and now she's working with Rural Action, our very great development group here with community and the environment and the economy. Those are the three emphases for Rural Action. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.